Hello, everybody. Welcome to GM Joel's Chess Week Recap on ICC. This week's show will be devoted to great games by women from Gibraltar to St. Louis. The Gibraltar Masters attracts a lot of big names every year, but it is particularly strong in participation of the world's strongest female players. Gibraltar offers huge prizes for the fairer sex, and with so many evenly matched players, it stands to reason that the winner will be decided in the last round. That makes it rather surprising that Tan Zhangyi was able to claim that £20,000 prize for the second straight year. She went into the last round with the lead, but needed a rating upset over French GM Maxime Lagarde to secure the prize. Her 7-3 score was only half a point away from first place. Now, the last game involved a bit of good fortune at the critical stage of the game. Let's see how it was decided. Okay, so we're going to pick up the action after move 32. White has just retreated the knight from attack to g2. And black has a very active position, but of course has to be careful because his king is exposed. And, black has a lot of kind of little moves that are perfectly okay. Queen d3 is not bad. Black could play a6. Black could play king c8. All of these moves, the engine provides an advantage for black. But of course, in a practical game, it's not so easy. And black actually went steadily downhill from here, played, maybe a more human kind of move, rook d5. And sometimes humans have the tendency to try to push these positions a little bit too fast and not recognize how vulnerable the situation is. So after this move, the knight comes into play, and black grabs pawn, and this was actually the decisive mistake because black can still play rook c5, which covers some important squares, and maybe something like rook b1, and then king c8 is playable, getting out of the pin, and black can at least hold on to his material. Probably queen f3, and it's not great for black, but still living, certainly. But after rook takes e5, now the position is very bad. And in fact, Tan did not play the most accurate move. It's actually a3, and it's just that the knight doesn't have a good place to go. If it goes to d3, okay, clearly that move walks into a pin, and there's no way to defend the knight. But, a knight has a good square on d5, but the problem is that allows the queen to jump into b5. And so what can happen then? Okay, if queen b6, queen e8 check, and knight c4, okay, that's a fork. And if the queen pins c5, the rook can go to b1 check. So white wins the exchange. It's a winning position. All right, so let's go back to that check again. And let's say black plays knight b6. White could give some checks again, and this will force the king to come up. And then there's this very cute move, knight c2, aiming to come to b4. And that's kind of a killer, because let's say queen d2, can he attack the knight? White can even just move the rook to a safe square, because there's a big threat of the knight coming to b4 with a check, and then the queen coming to b7 and trying to sneak behind to a6 or a7, and black doesn't really have a good defense to that. So a3 was really an insta-kill. Probably time pressure was going on. It was a very, very complicated game, with whites certainly having advantages at moments. And Tan played rook d1, and here Lagarde could play queen c5, or perhaps stronger than that, probably even stronger than that, is queen c3, and then black is okay. Actually, white doesn't have any special immediate continuation. But instead, he went for the centralization and domination of the diagonal. But the diagonal turns out to be not the important thing. It was really to cover the where the queen can go, and the queen goes to very strong square b2, pinning the knight, and basically black just loses a piece. If rook b5, it doesn't effectively break the pin because after a3, the knight can't move anyway, so white would win a piece. But after the move a5, rook d4, it's it looks like actually white is winning a rook now, because when the queen moves, rook d8 check, and then the rook hangs to the queen, and that's that. So rook d4 resigns. So sudden finish, a very complicated game, but Tan Zhang Yi with a very good score and a deserved first place finish among the women. Now the Brilliancy Prize, a not too shabby £1,000, was awarded to Anna Musashuk for her last round victory over Israeli Grandmaster Ori Kobo. The win still left Anna a point short of the top women's prize, but it's a heck of a game with several nice tactical points. It's a beauty from a beauty. Let's take a look. Okay, so Anna playing white, and it's a Sicilian. The first several moves, it's unremarkable, and I won't have that much comment about the opening. That's not really the most important thing. It's a Taimanov, and I used to play the Taimanov back in the day. It was my mainline opening, and the reason why I liked it was because it was an opening that you couldn't really castle queenside against. But then people figured out that you could castle queenside and play for the attack, and it just became less fun. So, of course, a normal way that white plays for the queenside castling is the English attack with the bishop e3, queen d2 type setup. But Anna, with the exchange on c6, frees her pieces to develop comfortably, and the bishop can come to d2, which is a little bit out of avoids blocking things that white might want to do in the center. Okay, so after bishop c5, that's really kind of going to encourage white to castle queenside for sure. But the move a3, well, okay, black has b4. The knight needs someplace to go to. So white secures that knight at the risk of allowing black to open the queenside later. But handily, the bishop on d2 is guarding the knight, so there aren't any bishop takes a3 tricks. So castles. h4, okay, now the king is a target over there, so white pushes the pawn, and this position has occurred a few times, with f5 being played as well in those games. And so far, white has continued pushing the pawn to h5, with certainly an idea to push it to h6, which will create a weakness in the dark squares. But here, Anna plays g4. This is a novelty, although not a very unusual move. White is looking for direct line opening. So black doesn't want to sit around. He tries to fight back in the center with d5. Now it's an interesting situation because it's unclear exactly how white should initiate capture. Certainly e takes d5 could have been considered right away. Anna started by opening up the G file, which did allow an interesting possibility for black of d4, kind of closing things up a little bit and chasing the knight back, although there is an interesting possibility suggested by the computer, and it really is very much a computer idea to go knight a4, and if takes, f takes e6, because black can't recapture because bishop c4 wins the piece back, and so white can try to attack with this big bubble of pawns on the right side of the board. Definitely a computer variation. But in any case, we have pawn takes. Now rook he1, of course, the rook ideally wants to operate on the G file, but the bishop has the G1 square covered. However, rook e1, putting that rook in the center helps a lot, because now if a rook comes to e8, white will snack that with the queen and penetrate it with the rook. So black retreats the queen to cover that square, but now white is in time to bring this bishop to this beautiful square on e5. So black has the e file, but can't do much with it. And white is dreaming of attacking this pawn on g7. So queen f1, the queen doesn't have immediate access to the king's side, so Anna is looking to bring to h3. Rook f8, and in this position, the engine suggests a4 is an interesting possibility to break down the queen side. Of course, if black takes, there's a bishop to come to c4, but I don't think that's a brilliancy prize move. So I like Anna's direct move, queen h3, putting pressure on f5, maybe bringing back the idea of pushing h5. Now, I don't think there's a direct threat at this point, but after black's move, everything starts to happen. Okay, the rook comes to h6. All right, directed against this h5 push, but now the tactics start. Bishop takes f5. Queen takes, and now rook d7, and black does not have a good way to block the attack along his second rank. The bishop is hit, and g7. Of course, the first point is this stock tactic that if you take the queen, the rook comes to g6, blocking out the rook on h6, and that leads to mate. Okay, simple but cute. And of course, if rook f7, white could trade queens and take the pawn on g7 and then take the bishop. So black's move is forced. He must retreat the rook to g6 to guard the g7 pawn. But really just beginning here, because if white rests on her laurels, something like this, white's a pawn up, but it's not a great pawn. It's not going to be enough to win the game. So white has to keep attacking. It makes sense anyway, because white has such an active position with pieces bearing down on the king that she should keep this initiative going. So bishop f2. Now, white could, just move the rook to d1 with an obviously much better position, but black can take this pawn on h4 and is still living. Now, for the rest of the game, Anna really just presses it home. She just plays the best move every time, almost like a computer. And she starts with h5. It's actually more important to save the pawn than the rook. Well, black takes the rook, hg6, and converging on g7. That's a non-starter. Interesting line is queen takes h5, and this is sort of, white has decoyed the queen away, and now comes queen f7. So if black takes the queen, rook b8 is a back rank mate, and if rook g8, bishop takes g7, and that's pretty much game over. Black really has to give up the queen, because otherwise the other rook comes into the game, and white doesn't even take the queen. White gives checkmate. So black is forced to move the rook. However, moving the rook attacks the queen. So Anna just moves it. And this is really maybe the nicest point, is that now if black takes the rook, h6, and the h pawn is a devastating attacker, threatening to take on g7, and black doesn't have a good answer to that because of two problems. One, the back rank is weak, and two, if this rook on f8 leaves the f file, then a bishop capture on g7, the queen will hang. So there's no defense at all to h6. But give Kobo some credit, because he really defended pretty tenaciously and forced Anna to find some nice moves. He stops that advance with h6. And so now the rook is going to have to move. All right, so rook goes to e2. Again, boldly played. The rook stays the most active, and Anna is not afraid of her king coming into the fray. Although at this moment you think like, well, if she'd only had time for king b1, it would be a little bit simpler, but then the game would be less fun, I suppose. So now we have bishop h4. and queen d4. So Anna just keeps playing brutal moves. She attacks the rook, and she attacks this pawn on g7. So now Black really has to do something. There is this move, rook to d8, that is playable. White would certainly be able to play rook b8 with a counterpin, and then can take this rook on g1. That's something that Black could have tried, but instead he went for this counterattack on c2 with rook c8, and it is actually quite tricky. White can maintain a winning advantage with c3, but that would open up the king. Maybe rook d8 would be stronger in that case. So she kind of cold-blooded takes g7 and g1. Now keep in mind that this bishop, now if this bishop moves anywhere, it's going to be a discovered check. It's a very important point. So Black takes, king e3. All right, so if Black takes the rook and gives a check, White moves away, it's end of the checks, takes, bishop f6 check, and White will in the next move or so take the bishop on h4, piece up for nothing. That's the recommended variation for Black from the computer. Well, that's why computers often make poor swindlers, because clearly that one is not gonna get anywhere. So instead of simply trading, Black gives a check, forces the king forward, and now an interesting moment. Okay, Black has a couple of checking options. One is rook c4 check, and if rook c4 check, White plays king e5, and that's about it. Black doesn't really have a check that makes any sense, so that they're going to come to an end. Note that, however, if White played king d5, queen f3 check, suddenly Black has very meaningful checks and is actually in position to win the game. So White has to be careful when running around with the king. So instead of rook c2 check, Kobo decided to try bishop f2. And White can win by taking either way, but rook takes is the fastest, rook c4 check. And now the funny thing is that the move king e5 actually loses, or comes close to losing, after queen takes h5 check. And now the White king is in deep trouble. There isn't any way to interpose with the bishop. And for instance, f5, Black can play queen e8 check, and the White king in very, very big trouble. But here, the winning move is king d5, and that's how the game ended. Black resigned after king d5, because there are checks on h3, there are checks on d3. Well, this would be a serious check for Black, except that White can respond to the check with a check of her own, bishop d4, and then Black is the one that gets mated. So that was really a very beautiful game. You know, remember that won the brilliancy prize for the whole tournament. Now, it was not a special women's brilliancy prize, and a very deserving game. Beautiful win by Anna Muzychuk, and we're going to hear a little bit later on in the show from her sister Maria. Okay, now the second Cairns Cup has gotten underway, began on Friday. The tournament is the labor of love for Jeannie Sinquefield, the wife of Rex Sinquefield, and partner in the amazing contributions of the St. Louis Chess Club. The 9 Grandmaster field, 10 players, 9 Grandmasters, boasts most of the world's top-rated players, including world champion Zhu Wenjun. Now, the first round produced only 2 decisive games. In one, Humpy Canero defeated the youngest participant, 16-year-old Carissa Yip. The tournament will certainly be a learning experience for Carissa, and it's been pretty rough going so far, but hopefully she will have some bright moments by the end. Now, the other game was, for the most part, one-sided, but featured a surprising moment where the tide could have been turned. Okay, this game was contested between Nana Zaganitsa of Georgia and the Russian player Valentina Gunina, who is actually the defending Cairns Cup champion. And to this point, everything has gone White's way. I will affectionately refer to her by my pet nickname of Dizzy, because she has two sets of DZ in her name, which is maybe makes her unique among chess players. But Zaganitsa has everything going for her. Pawn up, king is defended, black's position is all over the place. So Gunina goes for broke with the move e5. It's a very, very low percentage play, of course. If white just simply lets the knight come into f3, it will be a stock checkmate, but there's no reason to do that. Now, I was watching at the time, and for my suggestion from my spectator seat was queen f5, and this kind of controls everything, keeps the knight at bay. There's ideas to exchange on d7. The pawn on g4 is attacked, and a few moves the knight might come out. Okay, so Zaganitsa went for bishop takes d7, which does give up a beautiful bishop for a lousy knight on b8. But this certainly doesn't hurt anything, because in simplifying, white takes the rook off of h8. Okay, so when I saw this, I thought for sure that Dizzy was going to go for knight e3. This looks like a really powerful move. It attacks d5, the d5 pawn, the g4 pawn, and threatens a fork on f5. I mean, surely that's gonna break down any hopes that black has of resisting, of getting any kind of attack going. But Zaganitsa went for d takes e5, and while this move is winning, it actually creates a situation where white can go wrong. And for my money, totally unnecessary to allow the knight to come in. Really kind of bad spidey sense, because when the knight gets close, black can start dreaming that something will come of this pressure on the king. And in fact, after the move king g2, those dreams can come true. White should have played king h1. I think king g2 is another move that is really, really surprising to me. Why? Because while the king can be useful on g2 in some variations, why give black the possibility of queen h3 with check? Because now you always have the possibility, if you need it, of playing h4. And clearly, rook h8 is not going to be a possibility. White can check, and king e8 can play h4, and the black's position is just collapsing. But after king g2, now black actually has an opportunity to draw the game with queen h3. And the funny thing about it is that if black had gone for that, actually we'd have a situation where white would be in trouble, because black, it's true that both players understood rook h8, queen d6 check, and mate on d8, but black can actually play king f6 to set it up. In fact, even king f8 is good enough for a draw. The bottom line is, when you start really looking at the position, is that white has two pieces that can't move. So she's really only playing with the queen right now, and it's kind of hard to break the attack just playing with the queen. So after king f7, there's only one move for white to even draw, and the commentators felt that white wouldn't even be able to find it over the board with rather limited time, but I think she would have. I believe in Dizzy. I think she would have played c takes b4, but the thing is that that's only good enough for a draw, because she now has the c3 square to give checks. And okay, black has to be a little bit careful too. King g6, provoking rook d6, and then king goes back to h7. Now queen takes knight is a threat, and of course the knight still can't move because the mate on h2. So if white makes some kind of move to defend the knight, the king gets away again, and perpetual is forced. Gunina might as well have looked in that direction because the position is hopeless. But it's somehow, sometimes you trust your strong opponent too much, and you believe that you wouldn't really get an opportunity like that you could play queen h3 and even play a quiet move later. But with seconds on her clock, she played queen e6, and white can again play knight e3, but she played queen b7 check. Actually, just show the rest of the game. She took another pawn, and black's position broke down pretty quickly. I would have voted for knight h6 and followed by knight takes f7, but certainly you can't argue with this. And finally, rook takes knight, and the b pawn will just cruise right in. So, so Gunina losing a game she certainly should have lost, but there was that one moment when she had a chance to hold the game, maybe even win the game if Zaganitsa didn't find the right continuation, and so that's the first tough game that she had in this tournament. Won't be the last. Okay. In the second round, we definitely had more blood spilled. The strangest game again involved Valentina Gunina, and this time with Alexandra Kostenyuk, and the two have actually produced a winner in an astounding 80% of their encounters. Gunina, who, as I said, was last year's champion, got the jump on her compatriot when Kostenyuk produced some very strange opening maneuvers or strange queen moves, and that led to a terrible position. Soon she overlooked a tactical possibility, and Gunina had a very strong position. Now, Alexandra, who's not been having great results, she did poorly in Gibraltar, her rating has been dropping a bit, but she's a very strong fighter. And when Gunina made a few controversial decisions, the chances started to reverse, and Gunina, in the end, absorbed another hard luck loss with her metaphorical flag hanging at the end of the game. Let's take a look at that. Okay, Gunina is playing white. C4. I think this is known as a Duras variation. It dates back a long time, and I guess this prevents any action in the center as well as b5. And black can break the pin with bishop d7, but she decided bishop g4, as this knight is a defender of the d4 square, which has now been weakened. So white goes to protect that square. h3. Now I think that black should probably just cash in the bishop, because after bishop h5, white will potentially push back with g4, and the bishop will be very out of play on g6. So that seemed to me the first of a strange decision by Alexandra. But it gets weirder, because after knight c3, she plays queen b8. Nobody can really understand this move, because it doesn't threaten b5. White has too many pieces defending that square, so it's not really clear what the point was. And moreover, after knight d5, b5 is still not possible, because white has this tactic and a fork on c7 if black takes. So Alexandra went to correct her move with queen c8, but now the queen has moved twice to go to a square, which is not necessarily any better than the one it started on. So very strange. So the bishop is pushed out of play, and now comes knight d8. This is an oversight, and again, I was watching this live, and the commentators jumped on this very quickly, and Gunina took only about 6 minutes to be confident of the move bishop b6. So if black takes it, the knight takes on b6, and that's just a complete disaster. So black can do it a little bit at least better with knight e6, and she's lucky to stay in the game. And it's based on this particular trick. If knight takes bishop, knight d7, just no good continuation because we've got bishop takes d7 check coming, and white can take the rook in the corner, and the knight would be attacking the knight on c7. So it gets out. White just wins in exchange for nothing, and is also taken a pawn. But this b5, this keeps black in the game. Now, still can't take the bishop because rook c1. Okay. But you can take on b5 first, and now take the bishop. And now came a controversial decision from Gunina. Here she can play knight b6. That probably forces black to sacrifice the queen because, again, white is just going to start taking material and be up a couple pawns in an exchange. So knight takes, then white can challenge this rook, which is very important, take over the c-file, be even worse to trade because then the queen would come in, and then the knight can come back to f3 and guard d4, keep the knight out of that square. And even though black is not so bad off in terms of pieces for the queen, white has these beautiful connected pass pawns and can probably start pushing them down black's throat. And again, the bishop on g6 sitting there out of play. Gunina decided on rook c1. Again, black is forced to sacrifice the queen, but now we'll have a rook and two pieces for the queen. Now, it's true that instead of the rook is replaced for white by a very powerful knight on d5. It's a great knight, but it's still a knight. So the thing is that if black survives the short term, she will have long-term chances because she'll have a rook and two pieces, which is really well more than the value of a queen. So there is a risk involved with what Valentina did there. But in the short term, queen a4 is kind of a strong move. Black can't think about bringing the rook in because her own back rank is too weak. So she just defends, castles, and now Gunina makes a decision that turns everything around. A really very surprising one, because the knight retreating to f3 would just keep everything the way white wants it. The knight on b5 stymied again, the bishop on g6 out of play. Black would still have to waste another tempo with a move like bishop d8 before she could castle. And then white can take the c-file, maybe look to trade rooks like in the game or start pushing the pawns. And it's still, close to a winning position for white. Obviously, a lot of pieces on the board still complicated. But after knight g6, the position, really all results come into play because that bishop out of play is gone. And now the black knight is going to eventually sink into d4. So white does have this good plan of trading, and she covers against knight c5, of trading the rook on c1 for the rook on b8. And I think actually black should have stopped that with bishop g5. And then black is certainly okay in this position. Kostyanyuk decided just to go and exchange the knight right away, and certainly black wants to get rid of that. Knight d5, so the knight comes to a beautiful square. Now, in fact, white has to be super careful, and Gunina needs to play queen a6. This is the only move to get on the pawn right away, start munching or at least threatening to take stuff, and that preserves an advantage. But the natural a4, it looks like this pawn is just going to waltz right in. But now black actually is taking over the advantage because she's getting ready to crash through on f2. And in fact, the only move to prevent that and to hold the balance with best play is g5. Kostyanyuk answered almost right away with e4. She had a lot more time, 15 minutes maybe, against just a few, maybe 3 minutes for white. And black played fast here to try to take advantage. Takes, the queen has to come to c4 to bother the knight. King h1 is also possible. Knight e5, and this is a really critical moment in the game. The queen went to c2. Queen e2 seems to be enough to draw the game, but really by a miracle. If f takes e4, white can play b5, bishop h4, and b6. Of course, this really would have been impossible to calculate under the circumstances, with very, very little time left. But this is how it goes. Rook f2, takes. And now black, of course, is in a position where she has to worry about those pawns. Knight d3. And now comes the really amazing move, which, it's very hard to find, king e2, because king e3 loses. Knight c5, a5, and now king f7, b7. This is the big trick, but the thing is, it doesn't work here, because now black sets up knight c4 check to stop the pawn. That's why the king doesn't want to go to e3. But oops, I went back all the way in that variation. All right, so we'll do it again. Takes. This is how we got there. Not takes, rather, but b5. This is the star move. Check king e2. And this is why, because now we're going to play b7. So we get the king out of range, right? So because of that, knight takes a6, white will queens. So we get this pawn very far. King e3, and it's almost kind of a positional draw here, because if the black king comes up the king side, white will take the pawn, come to d4, c4, and b5, and that's going to queen very quickly. So the black king really has to go to the queen side, but white will go to the king side and eat there, and then black will run out of stuff. So to illustrate, we could see like this: king e7, takes. Now black doesn't have to actually take the a pawn, but okay, got to stop the h pawn, right? And now basically white will draw either by bothering the knight so that it can't just settle on a position on a square to stop the h pawn, or by using the threats to the knight to go and take the d pawn. So the position comes down to a draw. So that would have been pretty incredible for white to find. Instead, she played queen c2, and now b5 doesn't work because knight d3 is too strong, because it has this additional threat of knight e1 winning the queen. So white does not have time to make an active move. So because of that, she took the pawn on e4. And now it was actually black's turn to miscalculate. Well, although I don't think that it was so much miscalculation as a calculation that, rather than try to calculate out the liquidation, that Kostyanyuk would just play an aggressive move and pressure Gunina on the clock. Or maybe she might well have thought that she was winning with the move knight d3, but actually the correct move is rook takes f2. Because now this ending is easily winning for black because of this move knight c4. The problem for white is you just don't have a good way of approaching the knight. The pawns are just not far enough here. If you play king e2, you can't play king d3 because of knight b2 check, so you don't get anywhere. So let's try king f3. But now the key is that black actually goes and forces the pawns forward, because now black settles on b6, and can't get at it. I mean, you eventually can come all the way over to a5, for instance, but black can also bring her king over, and at some point will take the pawn on d5 if it's undefended. So black just wins this ending easily. So the move knight d3 was actually technically incorrect, although on practical terms, it would have been very hard for white to save with flag hanging, and I think Gunina made this move with seconds on the clock. She played queen e8 check. She can draw with queen e6 check, and the point is that black can't actually get a mating net going in time. The most desirable setup is knight e5 coming to f3. But the problem is that white is able to take the d pawn and cover the h2 square. Now black can play rook f1, rook f2, and draw by perpetual check. Black has perpetual check in many of these variations, but it doesn't seem that that black has more than that. In fact, even queen e3 looks to be enough to draw, because if sorry, put the king on h1, very important. Because if black goes for this plan of knight coming to f3, it seems that white is able to even draw this position, even with one tempo less of a pawn advance. This seems to be a draw as well. But unluckily, Gunina, I mean, she had 3 plausible moves. She chose the wrong one. And after king h7, it's over, because now this rook f2 and knight e5 is a killing reorganization. So she played f3, but now black is still threatening checkmates with rook a2. So white is gaining no momentum, and the king, in fact, is not getting away anyway. And after knight e1, that's game over. The finish could have been king g4, rook g2 check, knight f3. That's kind of the nicest one. Or king e3, bishop f2, king e4, rook e2. That's kind of a funny mate. That's a nice mate as well. So Alexandra Kostyanyuk pulling out a bit of a swindle. Certainly a game that she's not proud of the opening, but she showed great fighting spirit after that, and was able to take over and win the game and drop Gunina to 0-2. Now, Irina Krush is kind of surprisingly the oldest player in the field at 36, because I remember when she was a little girl playing in tournaments in New York. And she actually finds herself ranked 2nd from the bottom, but she has had good success against elite women's competition in the past, including 3rd place in last year's Cairns Cup. She missed a golden opportunity to grab a full point against Zhu Wenjun when the Chinese player, thankfully unaffected by the coronavirus outbreak, made a bold / foolhardy decision with a risky tactic. Let's see that position. Okay, we're going to pick it up after move 18. Now, remember, Zhu Wenjun is pretty fresh off defending her Women's World Championship in the very tough match against Alexandra Goyachkina, and emerging successful in the tiebreak. And of course, we all know how well the craziness is going on in the world because of that coronavirus, and even healthy people from China are at the very least having difficulty in traveling, and the organizers were very thankful when Zhu touched down in the United States and made it to St. Louis, because they were fearful that she might be quarantined somewhere, not allowed in the country. But she made it, and she has this position after 18 moves, in which Irina's really kind of outplayed her in the opening. She's just captured a piece on d5. And if white recaptures, black takes back with the bishop. And this is a position, it's a clear advantage for black. I mean, you may look at it, and I know a lot of you might say, well, the material is even, it can't really be that bad, but it's actually a quite unpleasant position for white with ideas of this knight coming to d3. And it's one where, white might hold it, but very difficult decisions to make, and black is just very comfortable. So Zhu decided to gamble on the tactics after rook takes c4. And again, I was watching live, and the commentators had this game up. And of course, they have something the players don't have. They have engines. So they knew rook takes c4 is a blunder. Now, black has various options. One option, fairly obvious option, is queen d7 to counter attack the knight on b5. And that forces white to come into c7 with whatever piece. Black can do this, sack the queen for 3 pieces. And it's a better position for black. Again, a clear advantage, despite the 2 pawns. But Zhu probably felt that, this is a position she can deal with because it's, it's unbalanced. Maybe this is more pleasant to play than the other one. But what both players miss is that bishop c6 wins. On bishop c6, if white takes on d5, bishop takes b5, black just wins because white takes the queen. Black takes the queen, and the rooks protect each other. Okay. So after bishop c6, white is apparently going to play knight a7, and that's the key move, because if the queen moves, white takes on c6 and takes on d5. If rook takes a7, e takes d5, and white gets everything back. But the problem is that black doesn't take on a7. Black has only one move to refute it, but it's a very big refutation. It's the knight moves to attack the queen on e2 with a check. So white takes the queen, black takes the queen. White takes the knight, black removes the knight. There's no more e pawn getting to d5 and winning the bishop. Black is just a piece up. So the bottom line is that bishop c6 is just a winning move. Irina thought for a bit. She didn't have a lot of time. Generally, these games are going very, very slowly, right? She played queen b8, find a third move. And after e takes d5, well, she could play bishop a6, but the knight can just retreat. Black can take an exchange, but white has a couple of pawns, is not really in any danger. So she played knight takes d5, and what white is basically forced to play knight c3, and Irina eventually played knight takes. The computers like to claim that black has a little advantage after rook a6 because of the bishops, but down a pawn, it's hard to do more than win back the pawn, and in fact, that's what Irina did. She played bishop f6, and she took back the pawn, and after a whole bunch of really kind of unnecessary moves, they agreed to a draw. Missed opportunity for Irina, and she's certainly going to regret that going forward. Now, Maria Musashuk made a quick statement in her first visit to St. Louis. Starting with 2 whites, she earned 1.5 points against the 2 rating favorites. First a draw with Zhu, and then a shellacking of Humpy Canero with an attack that was set up and executed with lightning speed. Let's check it out. Okay, so Musashuk plays e4, and you'll see from this game she's a pretty heavy puncher. So Canero with the Petrovs trying to cool things down. And this d4 move has become rather popular. I think that players have gotten tired of that knight takes e5 and knight c3 and queenside castling. It seems the black players have come up with good antidotes. So this is kind of what people are doing these days. Especially this idea, which looks a bit strange to double the pawns, but basically you leave the knight out on e5. Black can take it, but then white gets this kingside majority. In this case, Canero decides to give up the bishop for the knight on e5, and then bring the knight to c5. So it's very principled. The pieces are running out. The bishop can run away, but then black comes bishop f5. with a nice blockade on the king side and a good pawn structure. So instead, white just allows the bishop to be captured, straightens out the pawns. And from this position, it looks like nothing much is happening, a lot of trades. But the pawn structure is very advantageous for white in the middle game. That extra pawn on the king side helps signal an attack over there. But to get an attack, she's going to have more force on that side. But this is why the move rook b4 is so handy. A beautiful rook lift coming to that side of the board. And so black has to really respect this. Now, this position occurred once previously, a long time ago. Andrei Sokolov, the former top-level player many years ago, against Lars Schandorf back in 2001, Grandmaster game, and there black played f5, and in similar positions, black has played this move f5, and they with slightly different pieces on the board, and you have a protracted struggle. In the game, white took on f6, but that didn't really lead to anything. Canero played bishop f5. This is not bad in itself, but black will still have to make some accurate moves. And the aggressive h4. So, all right, so black has to make room for the bishop. h6 is not very desirable because after the bishop is pushed back, there's some targets to attack here on the dark squares. Remember, white has a dark square bishop. You know, white could play rook g4 and queen g3, and it's maybe not an immediate breakthrough, but certainly not pleasant. So h5 is a very principled answer, especially because the move e6 is calmly met by queen d6, and white actually has nothing. So Musashuk went for some violence here with g4. And this move was not as strong as the players thought it was, but it's definitely puts pressure on black. And Canero reacted correctly at first by playing queen takes h4. I mean, any other move is just white will just overwhelm on the king side. Queen g2, but this is the critical position. It's one where the engine, of course, sees everything and suggests queen g5, but this is not the most natural move because you're walking into the path of the bishop. But if the rook goes forward, this queen takes g4, that's not really a problem. And if the rook goes to the side, well, there aren't a lot of squares on the fourth rank. There aren't a lot of safe squares. I mean, you could go to an unsafe square, but then you'd have to move next on the next turn, queen h4, and the rook is not protected on a4, so white is not threatening to anything to happen here. So it's very strange that the move queen g5 seems to lead to equality. E6, you know, maybe Humpy looked at queen g5 and thought e6, this can't be good because now there's threats of e takes f7 and then rook takes whatever piece is there. But black can actually play rook e8, counterattacking this rook on e1, and that rook on e1 is the defense to the bishop on c1. So white doesn't actually have any good tactics here. Again, rook f7, queen g4 leads to nothing. So that was really the key moment. That was Humpy's chance for defense. But after queen e7, Musashuk just cleans her clock really very efficiently. She takes on h5. And she has a lot of good moves, but rook e3 is very principled. She's now got three big heavies in the attack. That's very rare that you could have you could lead an attack with heavy pieces like that. Almost no work really done by minor pieces. Very unusual attack, but it's very powerful. So black tries to pressure e5, and queen h2. White can also play e6 right away. Maybe perhaps even stronger is e6 followed by rook h3. But I think that that Musashuk just didn't see this idea yet. But after queen h2, now black is almost escaping. Okay, first Maria played rook f5. Okay, the rook can't be taken. Queen h5 is mate pretty cleanly. But black can play bishop g4. So this led to a repetition. The bishop has to go back to h5 because otherwise rook h4 is going to mate. And after bishop h5, she finds e6 cracking things open. And now the rook can come over. There's no counterplay on the e file. So king h7, black really had to play queen h7 and defend this way. Not necessarily so obvious, but white can play rook f3 or rook g5, a lot of strong moves, and basically white should break down the defenses. Even if Maria doesn't play that accurately, it's very, very hard to find the best defensive moves every time. And in the game, black went down pretty quickly. This threat of the exchange sacrifice on h5, and black stops it temporarily, but now by moving the king, getting out of the way of the g file, rook h5 is a big threat. And now here it comes. The nice point here is not so much that what Musashuk plays, but the fact that she needs to play queen c7, because if rook takes check, king g6, amazingly, white has no more than a draw. If rook h6, the king can come to f5 and is safe. White is no more than perpetual. Rook g5, I believe king f6. Yeah, king f6 is the move, and the king is getting ready to run out. So, you know, really that would be kind of shocking. But it was easy, really, for white to find the move queen c7. The king is forced back. The queen gets to this dominating square with check, and now rook h5 just simply forces a mate and resigns after rook h7. The mate would have been king e8, queen e7. So a very nice checkmate by Maria Musashuk. And you know, it's a really interesting question about the Musashuk sisters. You know, a lot of people probably wonder who is stronger, and it's really not clear. They're both, you know, consistently upper level 2500s, and it's very, very rare in history that you can find siblings who are both world class and so even in strength. So really kind of a marvel there. Maria Musashuk playing for the first time in the Cairns Cup, and I'm sure that in future editions, they will look forward to getting her sister, big sister Anna, to come over, and we've, you know, seen earlier in the show what she's capable of doing. Okay, in round 3, Katerina Lano Katerina Lano, and still in round 2, she easily defeated Carissa Yip. That was 4 decisive games for round 2. So she was one of the leaders in round 3. Nana Zaganitsa took advantage of Carissa again, unfortunately, for poor Carissa, for Nana's second win, and that gave her first place after 3 rounds. Dronavali Harika got her first win over Kostenyuk, who was not able to parlay her previous good fortune. Harika shares second place with Lano and Musashuk, who drew with each other. Gunina scored her first win over Crush, who spoiled an advantage she held for most of the game. So a lot more action still to go in that tournament, and next week I will have much more from the Cairns Cup, which I'm pleased to be able to cover on site from St. Louis, as I am here on assignment as the resident grandmaster at the St. Louis Chess Club for the next couple of weeks. All right, so I hope everyone enjoyed the show, and you'll join me, Grandmaster Joel Benjamin, next time on GM Joel's Chess Week Recap on ICC.